Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing Michael Shellenberger's recent book, Apocalypse Never, which was published in 2020 and it's really become an international bestseller, I'd say. It's been translated into 16 languages so far. And we'll be discussing why climate alarmism hurts everyone. Well, that's the subtitle of your book. Now, I'll just present Michael Shellenberger. He's a Time magazine hero of the environment. He's a Green Book Award winner and the founder and president of Environmental Progress. He's the author of several books. His latest book that's out, when was that out?
Last month.
Last month is San Francisco. I look forward to reading that, and maybe we get a little bit of time to talk about that.
Sure.
Towards the end. He's a TED Talk presenter, and his TED Talks have been viewed 7 million times. He's advisor to policymakers around the world and has testified before the U.S. House of Representatives. And he's a reviewer of the next IPCC assessment report. Shellenberger has been a climate and environmental activist for over 30 years. He's a leading environmental journalist, writing for, amongst others, Forbes, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Michael, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. The subtitle, as I mentioned, of your book is Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Why does it?
Well, first, thanks for having me here, Martin. It's been really lovely being in Copenhagen. So I wrote this book as I grew alarmed myself at the alarmism that was emerging really strongly in 2019. I'd actually previously been working on a book about nuclear energy, and I decided to broaden the focus when we started to see Extinction Rebellion in London, a climate activist group. People were holding up signs saying climate change kills children. Greta Thunberg said, "I don't want you to have hope, I want you to panic." And I remember thinking, I don't want for my worst enemies to panic, because panic the definition is unthinking behavior. We don't want to promote unthinking behavior.
During the Cold War, the last thing we wanted the Russians
exactly.
was to panic.
Exactly. Panic, bad things happen. We should want our opponents, our enemies, to be thinking and to use reason to guide our behavior. So I wrote the book out of concern for that. I also am very concerned, and have been for at least a decade, about efforts by environmentalists to deny poor countries the cheap energy they need to develop. Often now in the name of climate change. In the past, it was in the name of overpopulation. I'm somebody that spent a fair amount of time in poor countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and that really bothers me. And then my third reason is that under the cover of climate alarmism, we see efforts to basically make energy more scarce, including in the developed world. So there's been efforts to shut down oil and gas development. We're now in the midst of a major energy crisis globally. Europe, the United States, Asia, really all over the world, countries are returning to coal because we haven't been exploring for enough oil and gas. Meanwhile, we're also shutting down nuclear plants completely irrationally before their time, also contributing to energy scarcity, higher energy prices, which hurts human welfare, and also contributes to a worsening natural environment because you're moving towards more polluting forms of energy. So I had many motivations, as you can tell, to write the book, as I did.
You present some really depressing figures on what people think. I mean, children, how scared they are about the future. And could we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we just had, 2019, there was a survey, large global survey that found half of all people surveyed thought that climate change might make humans extinct. Of course, nothing like that prediction exists in any serious scientific study, and there's not even a mechanism for how that would occur. We know a study last month in the United States found that 75% of Americans experience anxiety and depression around climate change. And we know that 1 out of 5 British children say they have nightmares of climate change. That's almost certainly the same for children in the rest of the developed world. I think to some extent, people are going to find things to experience anxiety and depression around. That's natural for us to look for things outside of us to worry about. But I don't think climate change should be one of them. As I point out in the book, climate change is real. I think it's something that we should take seriously. All else being equal, we should want temperatures to stay as close as possible to pre-industrial levels for the simple reason that we've developed a civilization, agriculture, protected natural areas around this temperature bands. But if you had to choose for a change in temperature, you'd rather get a little warmer than a little cooler. And the fact of the matter is that most of the trends are going in the right direction. You know, when I first started working on climate change 20 years ago, the idea was, and this is the famous William Nordhaus who won the Nobel Prize, he said the optimal temperature would be around 3 degrees when you account for the benefits of fossil fuels and the disadvantages.
So the optimal temperature increase caused by humans, because there's also other stuff going on, would be around 3 degrees. That's what
the Nobel Prize winner said. And now, without any real significant climate policy in effect or a mandatory UN treaty, the treaty that we have is not a treaty, it's just a voluntary agreement. We're almost certainly going to keep temperatures below 2.5 degrees centigrade and possibly below 2.
Almost certainly below 2.5?
I would say, I mean, it's you know, there's a significant amount of uncertainty around how much temperatures will increase with concentrations, but sure, I think definitely below 3 and likely below 2.5. You know, it's not inconceivable that you could we could keep it below 2 depending on how much natural gas and nuclear we use. So the trends are going in the right direction. I point out that Europe has reduced its carbon emissions 26% since 1990. The United States has reduced its carbon emissions 22% since 2005. It appears as though the latest data suggesting that because there was less deforestation and more reforestation than they had thought, that appears as that carbon emissions over the last decade have been flat and maybe even declined.
But if India and China are going to move to our level of prosperity and beyond that, really, because they want to catch up with us, and by the time they reach our level, we'll be much richer. So this is an ongoing process. Wealth is increasing in our part of the world and faster in China and India. In fact, global income inequality is going down and has been for at least a couple of decades. And so, I mean, they will need to use more energy to get there.
Well, and they'll need to use more coal energy. India will need to use a lot more coal in particular. Yeah. China.
So emissions would go up globally, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you and I had to wager a bet right now, I would say emissions are likely to go up for global emissions are likely to go up for another 10, maybe 15 years. And a lot of that will come from India, and some of it will come from sub-Saharan Africa. China is doing a lot of nuclear power right now, 150 gigawatts of nuclear over the next 15 years. And of course,
much is that? 150
reactors.
Perspective?
150 reactors. To put it in perspective, that's more nuclear than the world has added over the last 35 years. So it's an extraordinary amount of nuclear energy.
And we have a situation where France is producing how much of their energy from nuclear?
About 70%.
Right. And the US is quite significant as well.
Almost 20% on 100 reactors. So you would think in China, one of those reactors is enough for 2 million people, electricity for 2 million people. So, you know, that's enough nuclear for 300 million people. So, you know, it's not to say everything's fine. It is to say that the situation has significantly improved over what we were worried about in the early 2000s. China did do a big coal build out. India's doing a big coal build out. We, of course, defend the right of poor countries to develop and to use cheap coal as we did. But I mean, I think it's interesting that the peak alarmism, we might say, in around 2020, 2021, 2019, I think came at a moment when it's likely that we're nearing the peak of emissions as well. And it's interesting, in the Apocalypse Never, I point out that in around the late 60s is when the population growth rate globally peaked and then started to decline. The overall human population will peak somewhere, we think, around 2030, probably around 9 billion people, depending on how quickly people are lifted out of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa mostly. But it was interesting to me to note that sort of peak population alarmism occurs at the moment of peak population growth rate. And maybe that's the same thing that's happening right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to return to what you were saying about, it's people will always find something to worry about. And I think that's true, but I also think that that there's a saying, no food, one problem, much food, many problems. You know that saying?
I don't, but that's brilliant. I've never heard that before.
Okay. Well, that's I think it's pretty obvious what it says, really. If you're, let's say we're both parents, right?
Yes.
And let's say we're in a situation where it's not certain that there'll be food on the table tomorrow. I mean, that's a big one. And,
right.
And all other considerations almost will, vanish from our perspective. And this will be what we worry about.
Yeah.
And then when we get food on the table, we'll be happy. I mean, that's it.
Right.
Problem solved.
Right.
But when we get to a situation where food is not a problem and, shelter and getting clothed and all that, then we start looking around and say, okay, what is there to worry about? And so we move, as we get more wealthy, we move further and further away from something that is close to us and that we understand directly and that is concrete, towards something that we don't really understand and which is abstract.
That's very interesting.
And I think that's what climate change represents. And biodiversity is also a very abstract thing. Also moving away from discussing poverty towards discussing inequality. Poverty is something concrete. You can sort of say, okay, what are we going to do about it? Inequality? Well, inequality can increase because Bill Gates gets more wealthy. Is that a problem?
Right.
So what do you say about that?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. This is, of course, in the 60s, there was this conversation around post-scarcity societies. Yeah. The ways in which people in post-scarcity societies start to worry about much more about their social status, where they fit in the pecking order compared to other people now that they've satisfied their material concerns. It's not to say that those weren't concerns in a high scarcity society, but they become a heavier focus. The other thing that comes to mind is the ways in which, the climate activists, with all of the anxiety they have, they say, well, what we're worried about is that climate change will run out of food. There's no, we have so much food. We produce 25% more food than we need. There's no scenario in which we're going to produce less food in the future, particularly as long as poor countries get access to fertilizer, irrigation, and tractors. So there's a way in which it's interesting.
Let's dig a little bit into that.
Sure.
Because I think viewers and listeners will go, what do you mean no scenario? It'll get warmer, we'll get more droughts. How can you say that there's no scenario where there'll be less food?
Well, first of all, they don't anticipate more droughts. Droughts follow, IPCC. You'll sometimes hear people say things like, they'll say it'll make droughts worse, or it'll worsen droughts. What they're saying is that in climate change scenarios, some parts of the world get more water and some parts of the world will get less. There will be environmental change. There would be environmental change no matter what, but nonetheless, they can say some of it will come from climate change. But we see actually a declining area under drought in the United States over the last 30 years, and we see no trend towards greater droughts over the last 100 years globally. We know that there's periods of very significant droughts worldwide over many millennia. We know that in California, for example, there was a very bad drought in the 10th century and also in the 12th century that lasted hundreds of years, mega droughts. So droughts follow natural variability. But in terms of agriculture, look, we're able to farm all over the world at all sorts of different temperatures. And in sub-Saharan Africa. So when you look at the United Nations Food and Agriculture reports, they analyze this.
Sorry for interrupting. Are you saying that global warming, climate change, or whatever you want to call it we do not expect it to cause more droughts? Or are you saying that it will cause more droughts, but that's not a serious problem?
We do not expect to see, my understanding of the science is that we do not expect to see more droughts. More droughts is not the prediction. They sometimes will say worsen. They'll say, because all droughts means is that there's less water over a period of time. Right. And the droughts actually is technically defined as less droughts due to natural variability and precipitation, but also from water management. And so you can avoid drought situations with gigantic desalination plants, for example, or large water storage facilities. But what we know is that if Africa particularly continues to get irrigation, fertilizer, and modern farming, that we'll see big increases in food production, including in sub-Saharan Africa. In the temperate regions, many of which we already have sophisticated agricultural technologies, if we do see significant warming, and we will likely in northern latitudes, you'll see farming be able to continue to move northward towards the poles. So, the fact of the matter is we're producing much more food on much less land. Agricultural productivity is just one of the big stories of the last 50 years. So
one way of looking at this is say, okay, we've had a 1 degree approximately Celsius temperature increase. And if you're correct, another 1 or 2 to go.
Yes.
So we're somewhere between a third and halfway there already. And what's happened until now? Well, almost every aspect of human life has improved generally. I mean, there's a lot of hardship in the world. And by the way, you write about that in the book. That's one of the great things about your book, is that you've traveled all around the world. You write about Bernadette and
Supartie,
and their lives, and they're struggling and they're poor, and you write about the situation around. We're not saying that everything in the world is great, but it was much worse 50 years ago, and almost all parameters have moved in the right direction during a time where there's been warming. Now, some people will say, well, that's fine until now. That's like, they say, it's like jumping out of a building and you're falling down, and then 10 floors down, you say, well, everything's been fine so far. That's what they're saying. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, well, and to answer that, let's just go back to, the issue of food production. We produce so much food now. I just did an article about this, that actually it's a problem for small farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, because it reduces the productivity of imported food. If they import food, it cuts out the bottom from their economics of small farming, so they're not able to compete with all the cheap food imports. So we're actually experiencing many more problems of cheap food than we are of expensive food, not just in terms of overeating in rich countries, but also for sub-Saharan Africans or Latin Americans or Asians. If they import a lot of food or have food dumped on them in the form of charity, it really destroys the economics of small shareholder agriculture. So, but the solution in every situation is just improving the technological capability of farming. So just agriculture is just irrigation, fertilizer, roads, tractors, the usual things to improve productivity.
So the IPCC or FAO or whoever is looking into this, what are their predictions? What are they saying about that? So you're claiming that adaptation, farmers shifting to different crops and using new technology and irrigation, etc. We expect that adaptation to create a situation where, despite warming, we'll be producing more agricultural products.
Exactly.
Is that what the experts are saying?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, one of the first things I remember reading on climate change that really made me kind of go, this isn't quite what I thought it was I read an early paper where it was an agronomist who argued that climate change might increase yields faster than would be increased if there weren't climate change. And the reason he gave is because he said there would be so much effort by governments to do adaptation that you would end up getting greater productivity returns. I think that's very possible, in the sense that when you look at the Food and Agriculture Organization, they do these graphs, and they show under a situation of rising temperatures in rain-fed agriculture, meaning no irrigation, you could see a very...
Like in Denmark, for instance.
Okay.
You've been here for a couple of days.
Yeah, sure. I think, but more particularly, they're really concerned about sub-Saharan Africa. In those rain-fed systems under climate change, you could get slightly lower yields. But if you add fertilizer, tractors, and the basics of modern agriculture, you get a significant rise in yields that just massively outweighs whatever modest decline from temperatures. And so this has been grossly misrepresented in a misleading way by climate alarmists, who say things like, well, under a warmer world, we'll see a decline in yields. a decline in yields if you believe that these poor farmers will never or should never get fertilizer, roads, tractors, irrigation. And in fact, that is often what they're advocating. But if you continue to think that farmers will continue to be farmers and that Africans will develop, so the really terrible scenarios that people end up describing, they're describing basically they're describing the status quo. They're describing African countries remaining poor in 2100 as opposed to poor African countries developing, starting with modern agriculture, but also urbanization and industrialization. And what I point out in Apocalypse Never, I trace that then to what has been this long-standing Malthusian demand that poor countries not gain access to these modern technologies. And this is where it takes a very dark look at what's going on here, so that you have the people that are predicting and warning of starvation in places like Africa, warning of continued poverty in places like Africa, actively seeking to deny places like Africa the technologies they need to produce more food.
Well, we also see, but isn't that a small minority of certain climate activists? I mean, if we think about the discussion in Glasgow, there was a lot of discussion about the rich world we should transfer more money to less developed countries, billions and billions, so that they can better adapt to climate change.
So that they don't develop. I mean, that's what's being proposed. I mean, even in the FAO report, if you read the United Nations FAO report, which I believe is called something like Global 2050, where they're doing these scenarios, where they show those graphs of how much of a big increase in yields you'll get with irrigation, fertilizer, tractors, as opposed to the modest decline in yields from climate change if they don't adopt those technologies. They then go on to recommend what they call the sustainability scenario. The sustainability scenario is one where they don't get the irrigation, fertilizer, and tractors. So it's built into these scenarios. It's completely schizophrenic, honest analytics, and Malthusian policy recommendations, similar to much of the IPCC is advocating for Africa to supposedly leapfrog to renewables. Of course, Africans are already overly dependent on renewables, namely biomass, wood, dung, the rest. So yes, it's built into the policymaking, and this is where the Malthusianism that got baked into United Nations reports around so-called overpopulation then got its old wine in new bottles in terms of the climate change reports, where they then continue this Malthusian advocacy. I trace it all the way back to the post-war period, where it really starts with radical conservationists concerned about poor countries developing and industrializing, arguing that they shouldn't do that, arguing that that would result in more starvation. We shouldn't give them fertilizer, tractors, roads, and irrigation because they'll starve. It was bizarre. It never made any sense. But then Malthus never made any sense. No. Malthus was essentially saying...
And that you're talking about Thomas Malthus, who was a priest when was this?
Reverend, yeah. Protestant, yeah. No, it's okay. Yeah. Reverend Thomas Malthus, late 18th century. I think his famous book is 1799. And of course, his famous hypothesis is that humans are doomed to periodic famines. It was never accurate, actually. Today we know, and we still see, famines are mostly an act of war. It's a way of denying people food. And that's what's going on in Ethiopia and Afghanistan and Somalia, Yemen. These are places where famines are deliberately caused against one's enemies. It's not something because somehow people suddenly forgot how to farm. And so that was never true.
There have been droughts and,
yes,
the disease around the potato famine potatoes were diseased. You write about that.
Yes.
And it's true, there's much more involved, but...
And Ireland was exporting food during the entire so-called potato famine. So
because it was really a poverty problem.
I mean, this is where Karl Marx, for all of our criticisms of Karl Marx, Marx was one of the first people to really properly describe the ways in which famines were political. They weren't a result of scarcity. I mean, you have to remember, like humans, we've been doing agriculture for 10,000 years. During all that time, there's been many, many droughts, and somehow human civilizations have survived. We prepare for them, we plan for them. Sometimes people say things like, we still hear this, they go, well, but are farmers going to be able to adapt well, what else would farmers do? Are you familiar with what farmers are exquisitely sensitive to the conditions. And yes, there's farming failures, but
there are different types of crops. But even within, maize or wheat, there are some sorts of wheat that are more useful, better to use in certain climates, and others that are and soil conditions, and others in other. And farmers carefully study that, because it's their livelihood depends on it. Getting it right. What should I plant exactly?
Exquisitely studied. And there's very interesting, of course, Esther Boserup is this famous economist who was at Food and Agriculture Organization, who really pushed back against this Malthusian assumptions. And she was basically doing very close study, cultural anthropology, basically. But, Somalia, for example, the pastoralists, the ones raising cattle, they would experience drought. They would then have this debt arrangement where they would borrow food from the people in the cities. And it created these really deep social ties. When the United States government, through the United Nations, dumped food on Somalia, supposedly to help them, it basically destroyed these very old social relationships and contributed to the conflicts. So there's a picture, people have a childlike view, I think, sometimes of food production, that they don't understand that you're dealing with really embedded social systems that have been around for hundreds, thousands of years, that farmers are not idiots. They're constantly adapting to new conditions. There's significant variability in all farming environments. And so, this basically, climate change got constructed in the same way it really came out of the overpopulation discourse, got constructed as a way to kind of gain power and gain control and exercise control by poor countries over developing countries, particularly through the United Nations, supposedly with benevolent means, but really always aimed at encouraging rather than reducing scarcity.
And that's really what Thomas Malthus was about as well, isn't it? Because you write in the book that his idea was two things were wrong. First he said food production can only increase in a linear fashion. That's wrong, because productivity of the land can increase. We can get to productivity. And that can be by a certain percentage, and then you have exponential growth of food production. That's actually what's been happening. But he also said that population increase will be exponential. So you have linear food production, that's wrong, but that's what he predicted. And then you have exponential population growth. And combining those two would always lead to people outrunning food. So that'd be food shortage. And the reason why you would always have exponential population growth is that he said we shouldn't control population.
Yes.
Yeah. So you shouldn't use, they didn't have condoms back then, but they had different ways of, they did?
Yeah, they did actually.
Oh, okay.
But it was mostly, you're right. I mean, it was mostly the rhythm method or basically timing intercourse to avoid, but also marrying later. This was, it was encouraging, abstinence until people would marry much later. This was a part of the success, we think, of the British, economic system, was discouraging early marriage. It was considered, they call it the European marriage pattern, where you were only supposed to be married once the man had a job outside the home for many years and could afford a home. And a home in which to bring his wife, and then they could procreate, but it was delayed childbirth, and that was one way to reduce the period in which women are fertile, but also the rhythm method. And yes, in fact, they did have condoms. Condoms are quite old. And in fact, when Malthus wrote his book, making the argument you describe, people at the time said this is not accurate, because of course we can control how many children we have. And of course we can increase agricultural yields, because that's what we've been doing for thousands of years. So it was sort of wrong immediately. And he really dug himself in. He was a bit of a hater, as we say. I mean, his father was all caught up in a kind of Enlightenment utopianism. He was reacting against a kind of liberal progressivism. And his father would host these gatherings where they would talk about how the world was going to be a much better place, and there would be prosperity, and there would be women's liberation. I mean, it was like the 1960s, actually, in the idealistic sense of a utopianism. And Malthus was really, really hated that idea, almost at a personality level. He really hated it. And then he went on to construct this really noxious theory. I think it's in some ways...
If we wanted to move into that, we could discuss the relationship between him and his father, but I think we'll
exactly.
But what I find really interesting in all this is the parallel between Malthus pointing to a problem, exponential population growth, and then denying the solution to the problem.
You got it.
There's a similarity to what's going on. You have it with nuclear. Obviously, we can get to that. But currently, we're discussing, food. How do we increase food production?
Yeah.
So people are concerned about climate change is going to, put pressure on food production. You and I say, well, that's...
Have you tried fertilizer?
It would be better if it did. But how big is the problem actually? Not that big. If we adapt, if we use modern agricultural methods, we can expect food production to keep increasing despite global warming.
Right.
And then they say, well, it shouldn't.
Right.
Which is kind of, what's going on?
No, I mean, it's funny. There was I think it was like 10 years ago, the New York Times did a story about an African leader. I can't remember which one. It might have been Malawi, where the president of the country went against United Nations recommendations and started to subsidize fertilizer. Well, shocking, they produced more food. And it was as though the New York Times wrote about it as though this were sort of some amazing discovery that if you used fertilizer, you would get more food in Africa. It showed how twisted the policymaking had been, how much of the so-called development community coming from the West, coming from Europe, coming from the United States, operating through United Nations agencies, had been recommending that Africans basically maintain low efficiency, low productive agriculture, that they not industrialize. We know that, there's been this sort of debate about how do you end poverty? Well, we know that really it's always the same things. You produce more food, you increase your yields, you have industries in the cities, almost always starting with manufacturing, almost always starting with very low skill manufacturing, making t-shirts, sewing shoes. And then from there, you can go up to eventually food processing, electronics. You can't get your way to making rockets or automobiles from having small peasant farmers, but they can go, this is how people go up the manufacturing ladder, and that's it. You build infrastructure, that's what prosperity is. Well, they've been promoting this idea at the United Nations that there's some different path to prosperity called sustainable development. Well, sustainable development is actually a way of keeping people poor. It's trying to make poverty more sustainable, not to make poverty history, which should be our goal. So it all flows out of a Malthusian ethos. It has a kind of radical conservationism in it. Some people describe radical environmentalism or this apocalyptic environmentalism as Marxist or communist. But you have to remember that Marx favored the Industrial Revolution. Marx and Engels, they would describe country life as boring, as oppressive.
A lot of old-style Marxists are pro-nuclear. So the Soviet Union wanted to industrialize,
absolutely,
factories, steel, and
yes, So this was one of the questions I had in Apocalypse Never is and Marx hated Malthus. They really hated Marx and Engels hated Malthus with a passion. So how did we get a marriage in the post-war era, both in Europe and the United States, of Marxism and Malthusianism? And what I ultimately came to conclude is that it was basically the agreement was Malthusianism for poor countries, and in rich countries, we would basically engage in virtue signaling. But I also now think that there is some effort to kind of turn back towards more primitive, lower productive energy sources. That's what renewables really are. Renewables are energy sources that could not power the Industrial Revolution. And so the folks that want to go back to them are, in an important sense, seeking deindustrialization, seeking degrowth. It's not just that they're kicking away the ladder for poor countries, they're really trying to undo the prosperity that we've had in the rich world too.
Let's get into that in a minute. I have another theory I want to try on you, and that is, so early Marxists thought that their system of central planning would be superior in terms of growth creation to free markets. That turned out not to be the case. That's been demonstrated about 25 times at least around the world with socialist experiments. So then, if you want to keep promoting socialist ideas, you need to get away from the idea that it creates prosperity. And
that's interesting.
So if it doesn't create prosperity, what does it do? Well, you can save the environment with it.
That's very interesting. I have to admit, I had not thought of that. That's a very interesting hypothesis. The argument would be then, and that's very consistent with a sort of criticism of that intellectuals are always basically trying to seek power over the economy. I think this was Hayek's criticism too, right?
Yes.
And really starts with Plato, of course, with, philosophers are going to run society, but then you get Marx saying that the economy, or whoever the intellectuals will run the planned society. That makes good sense.
All these entrepreneurs, all these ordinary people running around making all these individual decisions about things. It just doesn't, it's inconceivable to elitists.
Well, and I point out, I make this point in my discussion of how we saved the whales. We saved the whales when the cost of whale oil, which was first used as for lighting and for energy, and then it was used for really in margarine and soaps, mostly in Europe, Unilever. And then it became more expensive, and vegetable oils became much cheaper, and so you had a substitution of vegetable oils for whale oil. That happened everywhere except for in one country, the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah.
And so in the Soviet Union, the whaling industry, because they had political power through politics, through the planning system, they kept whaling long after it was uneconomical to do so. So yeah, absolutely, that price signal has been very, very important for saving nature, for environmental progress. But your hypothesis, I think, makes good sense. In other words, you get to a prosperous world, and Marx and the claim that centralized planning will outperform market systems is disproven. It's disproven really by, I guess you would say, by mid-20th century, and that would be the period in which they need to find some other justification for centralized planning. It's very interesting. That makes good sense. I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but yeah.
Okay. And also, they want a purpose-driven saving of the planet. This thing emerged. How did we save the whales? Well, it wasn't planned. It wasn't that petrochemicals were, we thought we've got to save the whales. We need to find an alternative, and then petrochemicals, and then this sort of happened. It's an emergent phenomenon, and so to some people, there's no virtue in that.
Yeah, I think I can appreciate that. I mean, it's disappointing that when you learn that we saved the whales, not because we were trying to save the whales, but because we didn't need the whales for energy or food.
Yeah.
Same story. I tell the story of the hawksbill turtles, which is we used to use sea turtle shells to make what we call now tortoise shell glasses. We used to use them as the original plastics. Now we use petrochemical plastics as a substitute. It wasn't because there was a worldwide campaign to save hawksbill tortoises. It was because we replaced the product. That's very interesting. I do point out that certainly I think one of the things that that reduced the allure of Marxism and socialism was just the radical prosperity that we achieved under democratic capitalist systems. And that meant that, if you wanted centralized control, if you wanted power over the society outside, to get control over the economy, then you would have to find some other justification.
There are seminars now around the world. I mean, it's a small group of people, but a small group of academics discussing whether, a green transition is possible in democracy. Sort of.
It's scary.
It's scary. Sort of suggesting that maybe this type of system has come to its limits, and we need to think about returning to something more autocratic.
Yeah, it's scary, and obviously we have to push back against that. I mean, it's interesting, of course, because on the one hand you go, well, yeah, that's what they've been saying ever since Plato. Sorry, we'll need to take control over everything in the economy, and there's always a response, and the public kind of goes, yeah, no thanks. Let's allow a part of the economy to be governed by market rules, and we have a very large part of the economy that's a public sector part of the economy, which we use in Europe is for our healthcare systems too, pensions. And in some parts of the world, whole electricity systems are really publicly controlled. So I mean, I see that too. I'm also very concerned that I thought that the climate shareholder activism to pressure banks and energy companies to stop investing in oil and gas, I thought that was strictly symbolic for many years, but it does appear that that contributed. It wasn't the only thing, but certainly that it contributed to the underinvestment in oil and gas exploration, which resulted in this oil and gas shortage. Obviously, we're having supply chain issues as well. Coming back from the pandemic, the oil and gas industry is eager to keep prices high after having had very low prices for many years. But there is a number of people, it's not, it's analysts writing for Financial Times and Bloomberg, Goldman Sachs put out a letter on it, basically saying the so-called ESG, environmental social governance criteria, has reduced investment that they think would have occurred under the same conditions, but had there not been this ESG movement, to have produced more oil and gas so that we wouldn't be having the shortages that we're having now. That's troubling because of course, for the impacts on the economy, but also for the impacts on the natural environment.
And the climate. So let's move on to that, because a lot of people would argue, well, that's a good thing. We want fossil fuels to become more expensive because we want to transition towards renewable. We want to transition towards non-carbon energy sources, right? I mean, that's really what we should be saying. We shouldn't be saying renewable. We should be technology neutral. But they'd be arguing that, say, well, fossil fuels should get more expensive. That's how markets work. So what's your take on that?
Well, part of me agrees because I think nuclear power is the best form of energy. It produces the least amount of air and water pollution. It's incredibly energy dense. And so a small nuclear power plant on basically the equivalent of 6 football fields can produce enough electricity for 3 million people. Takes 300 to 400 times more land to produce the same amount of electricity from solar or wind. So on the one hand, I'm happy because I think the higher electricity prices, higher energy prices is resulting in Britain, France, and Japan have all announced a return towards nuclear. It is actually creating new protests in Germany and new reconsideration of nuclear across the European continent. I think it gave life to the Chinese decision to expand nuclear. It's helped in the United States. On the other hand, it's also very clear that we don't transition from one fuel to another fuel because the incumbent fuel strictly became more expensive. It's also the case that we transition to the new fuel because the new fuel became cheaper. Natural gas has been replacing coal. That's one of the main reasons that European and US emissions have declined so significantly over the last 15 to 25 years. And so it's not enough, certainly, to just make the incumbent fuel expensive. You also have to make the new fuel cheap. And so for that reason, and we still burn a lot of coal, so why would we not want to make natural gas cheap and abundant? I mean, almost everybody thinks and understands that natural gas is a better fuel than coal. So why wouldn't we want to make natural gas cheaper?
Less carbon emitted per unit of energy from gas.
About half as much carbon emissions per unit of electricity, but also coal requires often destroying entire mountains in the United States or digging up beautiful forests in Germany. That's what they're doing. Gas obviously comes from underground. You have a very small well pad above ground. You've got a pipe, that goes underground, runs often now, at least in our shale formations, it runs horizontally rather than vertically, and then you can just crack the rocks and the gas comes out. It's, from an environmental point of view, obviously superior to coal mining. People say, well, but we'll use more petroleum. There's some evidence for that. I'm not saying it's not true, but also petroleum use is highly inelastic, meaning that
we'll use less petroleum if prices go up.
Some, not a lot less though, because, sorry. Some people worry that we'll use more if petroleum prices come down, and they're right about that. And then some people say we'll use less if prices go up. There's some truth to that, but there's not as much truth to it as people think, because we have to drive, we have to move products around. Petroleum is the way that we do that. Sure, maybe you'll decide to vacation closer to home rather than flying to the south of Spain or to Hawaii.
An electric car if petrol gets more expensive.
Well, that becomes even more interesting, because then, of course, it depends on where you're getting your electricity from. If you're getting your electricity from a natural gas, hydro, and nuclear grid, yes, it would be cleaner. But if you're buying it from a heavily coal grid, then you would not. There's other problems, I believe, that electric cars have, which is just the material intensity is higher in electric cars than in internal combustion engine cars. For me, that raises some red flags, because in general, the trajectory has been towards higher power to weight ratios in our end use vehicles, in our cars and trucks, but also trains over time. So the trains and cars and trucks, they're much more powerful, but they're much lighter as well. So I'm skeptical the Tesla is a beautiful car, but it's significantly heavier than an internal combustion engine car. I want to say it's somewhere almost a third as heavy. Okay. Don't quote me on that, but it is significantly heavier. We know that hydrogen fuel cell cars are significantly lighter than internal combustion engine cars. So for that reason, I get a little skeptical. You're moving large amounts of lithium from Australia. You're shipping large amounts of lithium around the world. It has a short lifespan. It's not totally clear how long those batteries will last. It could be 15 years. It could be 20. Maybe that's fine. I'm a little skeptical of it. I do, both Toyota and Honda are still very heavily invested in hydrogen. And there is the picture that the big energy transition theorists have always had, and two of them are characters in Apocalypse Never, has always been that you're moving from carbon-intensive fuels to more hydrogen-intensive fuels, so that eventually the vision they had was, you're going from coal to natural gas. That's going from one carbon atom to one hydrogen atom to CH4, natural gas, one carbon atom, 4 hydrogen atoms. And then you're producing hydrogen gas from that natural gas, H2, since it doesn't occur in nature. You have to produce it either from water, H2O, or from natural gas. And then eventually, their idea was that you have a nuclear hydrogen system where you'd have nuclear power plants. This is a very idealized model, but nonetheless, nuclear power plants both creating fresh water from seawater, producing electricity, and also producing hydrogen gas that would be pumped through the existing natural gas infrastructure that would, of course, it would need to be retrofitted to some extent to handle the hydrogen gas, but certainly could be done over a 50 to 100 year time span. That seems like a lighter system. That seems like a system that is more consistent with the history of energy transitions. But it's also, I didn't make too much of it in Apocalypse Never because it is, I think, farther away. I think we're in still for a very long period of continued oil and gas use.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of the discussion that you would have with people within a more alarmist leaning. That they'd be saying, well, we need to hurry up. We need to do this quickly. We can't wait for people to transition and markets to transition toward and deciding, is it going to be high what's the word? Hydrogen. Or is it going to be battery driven? We need to make decisions. We need to transition quickly.
Right. We need to panic.
No, but seriously, that's what they're saying. We have 10 years. We have 10 years, and by that time, we need to have reduced by so and so much. And if we haven't, then we won't live up to the target.
Yeah.
Which is.
It's funny how, like, even just characterizing the way people talk, you find yourself being out of breath and talking fast. And I think that, I think it's a trap when people are telling you to panic, that there's no time to think. It's an emergency. There's no time to think. That should raise our alarm bells. Energy transitions are always very slow. Yeah. It took a while to transition from whale oil to vegetable oil, too long. But nonetheless, it took a while. It took a while to transition from wood to coal. We're not there yet. We still have 2 billion people that use wood and dung. In fact, I believe there's...
Denmark is moving in the direction of using, if not wood, then biomass. I mean, 40% of our electricity... I forget the numbers now. But
a significant
amount of the Danish transition is biomass. And of course, that's not globally... sustainable. It's not something that can be copied in other nations. If we all tried to use biomass, there wouldn't be enough biomass in the world.
And this is
one kettle that's running all the time, boiling water. would need the size of 3 football, European football, soccer fields to create enough biomass for that. I know you can see that's simply not viable. So we're moving in the wrong direction. We're moving towards these sort of old way of doing things, burning things that grew on the ground.
And the Malthusian analysts who created those, they manipulated it wasn't an exact manipulation of the numbers, but the way they manipulated the carbon calculations was to say, no, it's carbon neutral because we'll have these forests that will also be growing and capturing those CO2 emissions. Well, yes, but if it were nuclear plants operating, then those forests would still be sequestering the carbon. They would still be capturing it, and you would have lower emissions than if you were burning wood, but obviously. Exactly. And look at it. There were real consequences of this move towards bioenergies. It means that your woodlands, which could be places for rewilding for bears and wolves and wildlife to come back on the European continent, which to some extent is occurring, but could be occurring certainly in the Scandinavian regions much more than it is. Continuing to use those forest lands for industrial purposes is not something that I, as a conservationist, am particularly excited about. But maybe the worst impacts have been the demand for palm oil as a biofuel, as well as certainly a vegetable oil for food consumption. But the demand for it by the European Union resulted in significant deforestation in Malaysia and Southeast Asian countries where the orangutans, one of our most spectacular primates, have been negatively impacted. I get upset thinking about it. There are cracks in the paradigm so that Greenpeace was finally forced to change its policy towards biofuels, but there's still this very dumb use of biomass. There's still people that talk about using biomass for negative carbon. I mean, it's all premised on an idea of degrowth. It's all premised on an idea of reducing energy productivity rather than increasing energy productivity. I mean, I think people don't quite understand that really renewables require spending more of societal wealth on energy. And if you actually, which is degrowth, part of what is driving economic prosperity, and sometimes it's hard to disentangle them, is rising productivity of labor, rising productivity of energy, and rising productivity of capital. Well, it's hard to sometimes disentangle them. I mean, if you have fewer workers operating a nuclear power plant than you do chopping down wood and operating a biomass power plant, then you've both reduced the productivity of energy and reduced the labor productivity of energy, or labor productivity of the economy.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned how much you need, was it 300 times as much land,
right,
to produce the same unit of energy from solar and wind than, say, nuclear.
That's right.
But you also talk in the book about the amount of stuff you need, the massive, materials,
yes,
resources you need to build the windmills and solar cells. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So we can measure the material throughput for every unit of energy. And the two of the most common are just steel and concrete. We know that it takes about 15 times more steel and concrete to produce the same amount of energy from solar or wind as it does from nuclear. This is very important because
it takes energy to produce steel and concrete.
That's right.
It's a lot of energy to produce that.
That's right. Right. So, I mean, I think one of the paradigm shifts that I want to encourage in Apocalypse Never is that the Malthusian 60s era environmentalism says we want to reduce energy and resource use. I believe that is incorrect. We want to reduce resource use. And in order to do that, we need to increase energy. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that there's a lot of resources that we save by using energy and information in new ways. The great example is your smartphone. It replaces newspapers, stereo systems, alarm clocks. My kids use it as a television set. Think of all the products that are now have been made unnecessary by the use of your smartphone. The smartphone, there's a small amount of resources to make this tiny object. So you've dematerialized, but it's taken a huge amount of energy. The cloud, all of these big server farms, they're huge energy hogs. all of the people, all of the service providers, all those app companies, all of Silicon Valley, the entire internet economy is still requiring huge amounts of energy. Yeah. So to get that dematerialization, you need to use significant amounts of energy. Bitcoin is now making headlines for the amount of energy is required, which is why Bitcoin, so many of these cryptocurrency companies are operating in places like Iceland, where they feel like they can get cheaper electricity. So the picture that people should have is of, and the goal should be of dematerialization. And that goes for the fuels as well. When you go from wood to coal, you get twice as much energy out of the same volume. When you go from coal to natural gas, you get significantly amounts more energy with significantly less material. You're obviously turning it into a gas. Yeah. And then when you go to nuclear, you know, a Coke can worth of uranium,
off the scale.
Yeah,
I mean,
a million times more.
Amazing. It's
amazing.
How much is it your whole lifetime's worth?
In one Coke can of uranium. Yeah. And then people say, what about the waste? A Coke can's worth of uranium. Tiny quantity of uranium provides all the energy I would need for my high energy life. And I fly a lot, which is a very high energy thing to do. And so, yeah, exactly. Shame on me for not having an entirely all nuclear life. So that should be the goal. And then people say, and then the waste product is a similar way you think about it. The waste product from that nuclear, from the fuel is the fuel. Technically, because you've taken a tiny amount of energy out of that fuel, actually only 2% or so. It's a slightly less waste than comes in as fuel, but it's unnoticeably the same. So that's your waste product as well. And it turns out with nuclear, it's not even waste because you can reuse it as fuel in the future. So the picture is we can get to a world where, and I think it's the same in Denmark as it is in Netherlands. You know, when I fly out of the Dutch, I always love flying out of the Amsterdam airport in the early morning hours because you see all the greenhouses around the airport. This is a very energy intensive way to produce food, but you're highly productive. You're producing gigantic quantities of food on small amounts of land. So again, you're substituting energy for resources. So if you imagine a world which is, you know, almost entirely powered by nuclear, where your food is being produced in very productive greenhouses, people are mostly living in cities, and our countrysides are for wild, you know, grasslands, forests, where you can have wild animals, but you also have room for whatever people like, golf courses, not for me, but for other people. You should have a planet where the human footprint has been shrunk to very small size. I think that's a future for all the depressed, anxious kids out there who've been influenced by Greta Thunberg. They need to know that they can have that future.
It's a very, very interesting point, and I hadn't thought about it until you pointed it out in the book and the talk you made last night as well here at CPOS. That you need more energy to dematerialize, and that I think it's a very deep point. So you have different goals, and which is the most important. We don't want to use less energy. We want to stop emitting carbon.
That's right.
That's what we want to do. But I'm sure that a lot of the environmentalists don't see it that way.
Right.
We're not going to go into a sort of long conversation about the pros and cons of nuclear. I've done that in other podcasts. Sorry, guys, they're Danish, but we can link to those. But I think part of what's going on is they do have concerns about nuclear, but I think part of what's going on is also they want a society where you need, a bit like a war economy, where the government steps in and says, okay, we have limited amounts of this and that, and now we ration it. So you get your ration of carbon, and you get your ration of this, and you get, and we don't need all that if we have plenty carbon-free, cheap energy. Then we can just continue with a free market economy and a sort of liberal society, and people can do whatever they want. They don't want that.
That's right. Yeah. That sounds like a nightmare to them. Yeah. So then on what basis will they be able to control other people's lives if there's no climate justification? That's why nuclear is taboo, and it is viewed as the enemy of many climate activists because at some level they understand, and I don't think it's entirely conscious, by the way, But at some level, they understand that a world that's powered by nuclear, that's not producing any carbon emissions, there is no environmental crisis. And maybe they want the environmental crisis. The environmental crisis gives their lives meaning. It gives them some social status. It gives them something to moralize about. They feel like they can then have some larger purpose in the world.
And they get to criticize free markets and capitalism.
That's right. They get to look down on the society, whether it's, it's about capitalism. Although I think some ways it's more I think it's simpler than that in some ways for people. It's a way to feel superior to other people. It's a way to moralize. It's a religious impulse.
Virtue signaling.
Yeah, that's right. And, it's interesting. If you read Greta's own stories about her life and her mother's description of their lives, she was a girl who was anxious and depressed. She felt depressed certainly about the world, but also she was socially awkward and somewhat ostracized. And as soon as she starts moralizing about the end of the world and saying how she's going to go and be this hero, she was rewarded socially for it, and she gained all sorts of social status from it, became a major celebrity, and that must have felt very good. And so there's nothing wrong with feeling good about these things, but there is something very wrong about encouraging other people to panic or to feel depressed and anxious. So I would like to, I think humans are humans, and it's okay to want to have a crusade to some extent, but why can't that crusade be for everybody to live a high energy life? Why must it involve trying to keep Africans and Asians and Latin Americans poor?
Yeah. Have you read Andrew McAfee's book?
Yes.
More from less?
Yes, of course. Excellent.
So I mean, I think he's showing, he may be wrong, some of the figures may be wrong, but I think he's showing that we're not just talking theory here, dematerializing. It's actually happening. So in Britain and other countries, they are using less materials in building. I mean,
of course,
if you measure it in tons, it's actually going down because we're getting better at, using stronger materials. So you need less of them, et cetera, et cetera. And that also needs information.
Yes,
to get there. It's an innovation process. It's about technology.
Right.
So we're never going to be building, I assume, without materials.
No.
But we can get to a stage where we use significantly less materials, even for something like building. And then, of course, with paper, we can get to a situation where we rarely ever use, well, I have this piece of paper with me here, but, I print very little now. I read my papers and
for special purposes.
Yeah,
absolutely. Exactly. Or, when I started doing politics 25 years ago, I used to read, 5 newspapers a day. I mean, can you imagine? It was a huge stack. So that's wonderful that we don't need that anymore. In fact, we have problems now managing our abundant forest lands in California because they're not needed economically. Precision agriculture is another area where we've become so much more land efficient. And so that's what I worry about when
water efficient
but fertilizer efficient. I mean, they're using
the stuff that's going on in California. Part of that, as I understand, you probably know a lot more about this than I. That if you subsidize water to farmers, they spend it in careless ways.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas if you just stop subsidizing, or maybe even put a small tax on it, they would start using water in much more intelligent ways. You can probably decimate the amount of water you use.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox in that sense. And you definitely get a lot of innovation from that scarcity. And we know that scarcity can be the mother of invention. We also know that we can produce abundant water with desalination plants on the coast of California to allow the water to be used by farmers. But certainly the precision agriculture, what they're doing with GPS, what they're doing with these, we call them sort of space tractors, these self-operating, self-driving tractors. The insides look like something out of a NASA Houston control panel, operated from space. Yeah. It's beautiful. It's remarkable. It's incredibly productive. They're able to significantly reduce nitrogen runoff. It's been obviously a concern because you can end up killing off your waterways. And we know in Netherlands and places like that, there's been high levels of nitrogen pollution. So as we get much more efficient in the use of pollution, we obviously save money. But it's a similar story across the board on all sorts of energies. I mean, we don't want natural gas to leak. That's what we call methane leakage, methane being natural gas. Well, there's obviously a for-profit incentive in avoiding losing your main product. And so there's good reasons to think that those systems, those natural gas systems, will continue to become tightened. And that may involve a role for government regulation in all these cases, but nonetheless, the trend is absolutely towards dematerialization, and we should encourage that and be wary with any proposal that would take us in the opposite direction.
So the common theme here is productivity. We want to increase the productivity of the land because then we can use, and that's actually happening, we can use less land to produce more food.
That's right.
And some of the land can be returned to nature. That's happening all over the world. We can increase the productivity of labor so that people can earn more. In 1 hour, they can produce more. Wages go up with productivity.
Yes.
Very strict linear correlation between those two. We want to increase productivity of energy, as you point out. So we want to produce more units of GDP per unit of energy. And that's happening as well.
Yes.
And we can go on and on about this. We want to increase productivity of different resources, steel, concrete, etc., etc. It's all about increasing productivity. And the way we do that is through innovation and technology and bright ideas that people get.
That's right. I think there's another concept that's related to that, which I wanted to communicate in Apocalypse Never, is also the idea of density. Energy density is the amount of energy in the fuel. So uranium, because of the process, really has more energy density than a lump of coal. But I also think that we see power density. That's the amount of electricity per unit of land. But we also can measure power density in factories. Our factories have become more power dense. Our buildings have become more power dense. And that's overwhelmingly a good thing. The information economy.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that there's much more lighting, there's much more electronics, and that's a good thing because we're actually increasing the productivity of labor. You and I are alone in a room right now. We don't need additional staff here because the electronic systems, the cameras have been set up in such a way as to be quite automated and allowing for we hope, allowing for your staff to do other things. And so these things are really bundled. It's interesting to see in the pandemic people, moving and doing more remote work, but in some ways there's still an increase in density of information with Zoom. So for example, just with Zoom, I find myself, jet travel gets you and me in person. Zoom gets our faces, which is providing significantly more information than just the audio. So this increasing density of information, of energy, of knowledge, I think we should embrace that and see that as something that then allows us to have other spaces on Earth that we can allow to be wild and nature. So those two things actually go together. The big dynamic is as fewer people are producing food in the countryside, and moving to the cities, that should allow us to allow for this rewilding to occur. And in Apocalypse Never, I feel like it hadn't been highlighted sufficiently in much of the what we would call conservative or market environmentalism. It hadn't been emphasized the ways in which the benefits are that you also get a wilder, more verdant, more ecologically vibrant world as you get this greater power densities and knowledge and information densities in cities.
Let's wrap this up and go full circle back to what we were talking about at the start. I have this quote. This is from Julian Simon. I read this book back in the 90s, and I wrote my own book with some of the ideas similar to yours in Danish. After that, The Ultimate Resource 2 by Julian Simon. And I'm not sure if this quote is from that book, but it's from around that time because he died in 97 or 98 or something like that. And he said this: "This is my long-run forecast in brief. The material conditions of life will continue to get better for most people, in most countries, most of the time, indefinitely. Within a century or two, all nations and most of humanity will be at or above today's Western living standards." In fact, that's probably going to happen much quicker. And then he says, "I also speculate, however, that many people will continue to think and say that the conditions of life are getting worse." So he was spot on both those.
Yes.
What's going on there? Why do people think that things are getting... So I can understand why people would say, we think that in the future things will be getting worse because of climate change or whatever. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying things are getting worse in a situation where everything's getting better. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent we are suffering some consequences of our prosperity. And certainly one of them is, and I think it's more acute in the United States than in Europe, but certainly one of them is, as we gain more freedom, we also can become more lonely. We have our weaker social ties, declining family and extended relationships. I think that's all a part of it. I think with less manual labor, we're not getting the physical exercise that we need, which we know is important to mental health. And that leads us, as we so often do, to project our own problems onto the rest of the world. We have so much more leisure time, most of us do, which is time to
watch Greta Thunberg.
Yeah, and get worried about things and to have anxieties. I mean, I went back to the family farm with my mother and her sisters, and we interviewed them around the farm in Indiana, which is in a northern part of the United States. And they described what life was like growing up in the 40s and 50s, and, you know, babies dying of measles and guys getting their fingers cut off or their legs cut off and all sorts of horrible incidents. And I said, wow, it sounds really rough. What was it like? Oh, we were very happy, you know, because we had each other, and they would go to church every Sunday. They never took a vacation.
There's some truth to that, but that's a social thing. But I think if you ask people, you know, is global income inequality going up or going down? They'd say, well, it's going up. Is poverty going up or down? It's going up.
Yeah.
It's food production. You know, all child mortality, education, all these indicators that you and I know are moving in the right direction. A lot of people will claim, no, they're moving in the wrong direction. They don't know this. Hans Rosling has done great work to try and persuade people. But he's also shown that people's instincts are to think that it's going the opposite direction of where it's going.
It's interesting. I would like to. Hans Rosling I'm a huge fan. It was sad that he passed away when he did. I would be interested to see if that is still the case. I think that was definitely the case 10 years ago. There's been so many of us. It's been Hans Rosling, obviously Sipos here in Denmark, Bjorn Lomborg, our work, Steven Pinker. Yeah. There has been, you mentioned Andy McAfee. Matt Ridley. Yeah. I have seen a significant pushback to that, at least on the issue of poverty. We have seen a lot of stories about rising incomes, including in Africa. I think the other change is, of course, we've seen China become rich in just the last 20 years. Yeah. And so it would be interesting to see if ordinary people still think that. I certainly think some segment of the population, certainly a third of the population, the most depressed third, probably has that view. But I would be interested to see if some of that has changed over the last few years. I think it might have.
Interesting. So all this anxiety about the future, that would be people thinking it's been improving until now, but from now on it's going to get worse.
Yeah, and that gives me some hope.
That would be the hypothesis there.
That's possibly what's going on. Although it's interesting because, you know, we are in such a, on the one hand, yeah, I mean, it may be that people will continue to become pessimistic as things get better, because that's part of what happens as you get rich. You become sort of more depressed or more anxious in some ways, or you're trying to seek ways to feel superior. And the way you do that is by saying the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket. It's also the case that we're in an environment where it matters. Podcasts and Twitter and social media and this ideological conflicts and discussions, I think, do have an impact. So at least, you know, I see signs of it. I mean, I certainly, you know, the issue that, you know, that I care so much about is nuclear. We've seen very significant changes over time in people's attitudes on nuclear just over the last 5 years. It does give me some hope that this kind of discourse and dialogue and this kind of education of the public does pay off, that we will start to see some more changes. And we could see that with alarmism as well over the coming years. Well, I'm going to read another quote to you. This is from that sort of great No Limits writer Nassim Taleb. He says, if you see fraud and you do not say fraud, you are a fraud. And I think part of, I love your book. I think it's a great book. Thank you.
and you write into a tradition. We've mentioned some Julian Simon and Matt Ridley and all these people, but you write in a different style, and you have some content. Your travels around the world. There's much more storytelling in your book, case-based stuff. But there's also something, the journalistic side of you, where you challenge people. You contact them. You said this. Why did you say that? Is it correct? If it's not, why did you say that?
Thank you.
And that's very interesting. I think we need a lot more than that of that than just that's the way forward. Because the truth is, a lot of experts on climate, the climate economists, climate experts, and others, agree that this is not the end of the world. The world is not going to end next Friday.
Right. And they'll admit that when you confront them on it.
Exactly. But for some reason they keep quiet. And,
yes.
And I think so I'm interested in taxation, for instance, and how it distorts the economy and all that. But and capital gains taxes in Denmark are very high, and I'm concerned about that. But if somebody came along in the media and started saying, if we don't lower capital gains taxes, then all, investment in business is going to go down and all the big business are going to leave Denmark, I would, maybe if one person said it, I would think, well, I can't debunk everything. But if it became something of a theme, I would feel obliged to say, no, I'm concerned about capital gains taxes, but that's taking it too far. That's not true. And I would consider myself a fraud if I didn't do that.
Yes.
They would be sort of pulling things in my direction, but I would consider it, let's stick to the truth here.
Yes.
And I think there are a lot of people out there who currently aren't doing that in the climate issue. People who are concerned
who know
about
better.
Climate, who they know better, and they should be intervening, and we should put them to task. We should say, why are you going out there saying what Greta says is wrong? When Joe Biden goes out and says we need to save the planet, well, it's a very fuzzy way of. He could say, well, I didn't mean it that way, but he does give the impression that the sort of the life on Earth is at stake, and climate scientists and others should go out and take issue with them on that and say, you're being too alarmist here.
That's right. Well, and I 100% agree. I had a debate with a well-respected British climate scientist on a British TV show when the IPCC report came out during the summer. And he was quoted saying in the British Guardian newspaper, "We are hopelessly unprepared." And I confronted him on television. I said, Richard, we're more prepared than ever. And he sort of said, well, yes, that's true too. Well, okay. I know what you mean. You're trying to have it both ways, though. And it's scaring school children. You're causing nightmares with school children. Well, boy, I had a lot of people complain to me that I was too rough on this poor climate scientist who, sits there bandied about uncriticized for the engagement in alarmism. I totally agree. And I would just add, I think that you're doing this podcast, you're engaging as a journalist is very healthy for that, because traditionally, in the post-war era, certainly up until recently, you sort of had politicians, think tanks, and journalists. These roles are now starting to blur with changing media, where where journalists, first of all, are behaving as activists often, as politicians. There's some of the politicians in the United States who are actually have their own podcasts and are behaving like journalists. I think you have think tank people behaving like journalists. And so I think that given how often terrible the media coverage has been, it's incumbent upon us to make our own media, but also to behave like journalists, ask those hard questions, certainly to call our colleagues when they engage in this kind of irresponsible alarmism. But I think this sort of engagement by the think tank sector in journalism is a really salutary trend that I hope you continue because I do think it's necessary and there's new opportunities for it in the new social media environment.
I agree. And I'll do that. I hadn't thought about myself actually there, but I will start pulling people in that I disagree with on climate and say, why did you say that?
Absolutely.
And I have actually tried to do it. The climate correspondent of the Danish national broadcast, I invited him in and he said no.
Well, then I think
one of two people, the other was a communist.
Then it's worth going on Twitter and saying, I invited this person to come on my show to have a conversation about this, and he refused. And I think it's good to call them out a little bit on it. Because right now you're in the mode of a journalist with me, and it's a lovely mode. And then I think to be on Twitter, I don't know if Twitter's as big in Europe, but certainly in the United States, which so often is driving some of these media trends, it is where the journalists hang out a lot. And journalists don't like to be called out on Twitter, but they need to be, as do politicians. Increasingly, we find that, and my Twitter following has grown from 0 to 150,000 followers over the last, I guess it's been 7 years. That I've done that by openly challenging people in a polite way, of course, in a depersonalized way, in a rational way, but nonetheless saying, you said this, here's what the evidence is. You can present it all on Twitter, and people don't like that. They will take measures to either engage with you or to correct the record, or at least not do it again next time.
So just for the record, we both believe that climate change is a threat, and it's, humans are causing it, a part of it, significant part of it, and we need to do something about it. What we disagree with are the people saying that we need to do things that will harm prosperity, and especially prosperity and growth in the third world, in the developing world, where they really need it. And that we should use methods to get there that will be even more harmful to growth when there are better, more clever ways of dealing with it. And that a bigger part of it is adaptation than actually avoiding growth, which is essential for human flourishing.
That's right. And we're also asking the climate alarmists, if you care so much about climate change, why do you oppose the two main solutions to it, which have been natural gas and nuclear? And if you're so concerned about poor countries, why do you oppose helping them to have the hydroelectric dams, the irrigation systems, and the fertilizers that they need in order to improve agricultural productivity?
Michael, thank you very much for being part of my podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Martin.